Okay, let's begin. The superficial back line starts actually under the foot on the bottom side of the 5 toes and stretches across the bottom of the foot in the plantar fascia. Now let's see what that looks like anatomically on the slide. You can see the plantar fascia there stretching across the bottom of the foot as one long line. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that the plantar fascia is really providing a bowstring across the arches of the foot, so that as the plantar fascia stays tight enough, it acts like a bowstring that keeps that arch up, and the plantar fascia ties into the front of the heel bone here. Now, this is a place that where it ties in, the plantar fascia, we say it ties into the front of the heel bone, but it in fact ties into front of the periosteum of the heel bone. So that if you have somebody who is running or doing some other activity where they land like this, bam, bam, bam on the ground, they tug, 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 tug on that plantar fascia, and it starts to pull the periosteum away from the bone here. And bone making cells, which are plentiful between the periosteum and the bone, go, let's fill in the periosteum. That's their program, is fill in under the periosteum. So as the periosteum gets pulled away from the bone, they fill in under there and create a bone spur. However, in our anatomy trains idea, what we're looking at is it doesn't end there. It goes around the heel with the periosteum, or even through the heel with the fascia that goes through the heel bone, and comes up the other side, and we can keep right on a-going. Where do we go? We go right up the Achilles tendon, and you can see that on the next slide. The Achilles tendon comes up through here from the back of the leg, starting, we'll make it start a little bit narrow here so it looks like a real Achilles tendon, and it comes up from there, getting wider as it goes, to, with the soleus on this side of the Achilles band and the gastrocnemius on this side. Since we're doing the superficial back line, we'll go with that superficial muscle, the gastrocnemius, and that's going to carry us across the knee to where the gastrocs reach up over and tie on to the backside of the condyles of the femur. Now, if you look at this, this whole structure here is also kind of like a bowstring. And the arrow in the bowstring, notched into this bowstring going around here, is the heel bone. So as this gets tighter, as you have a tighter and tighter Achilles tendon, as you have a tighter and tighter muscles, soleus or gastroc, that are pulling on it, you're actually going to push that heel bone right into the ankle joint, into the subtalar joint and ankle joint. And that creates a lack of mobility in the heel. It can create a lack of a good ability to ground through the heel. You see this a lot in people who are leaning forward, because as they lean forward, they tense on the Achilles, and that jams the heel into the ankle joint. Okay, now as we go up here, the next line, the next piece of our line here is going to be the hamstrings, and the hamstrings are going to go up here to the back side of the ischial tuberosity, and now we can see the line from the back here. And but this line through here requires a little bit of explanation. At the back of the knee, we run into our first fudge factor. I set up the rules for the anatomy trains, and every once in a while we're going to have to break them, but we'll learn something each time we break them. Okay, so let's look at the anatomy. If we look at the anatomy of the back of the knee, we can see that the gastrocnemiae, the heads of it, come in and reach up and grab hold of the femurs. The biceps are reaching down outside of them, the biceps on the outside and the semis on the inside, reaching around the gastrocnemius heads to take a hold of the fibula and the tibia, respectively. But that's not really an anatomy train. It's not continual fascia running across there. They run up next to each other, but they don't really hook. But they do really hook when the knee is extended. So if I take and I drop this on the floor and I go down to pick it up with my knees bent, what you see is I disengage that train. But as I straighten my knees, the condyles of the femur come back against the heads of the gastrocs and the tails, the tendons of the hamstrings, and interlock them just kind of like a fireman's carry into one sheet, one line, one band. So that if I reach over to pick this up with my knees straight, I feel the restriction in my hips as I go against that anatomy train, which we now see is starting from right under the toes, going around the heel, up the back through the Achilles tendon and the gastrocnemius, and up the hamstrings to the ischial tuberosities. So it's not an anatomy train when the knees are bent, but it is an anatomy train when you're standing up or your knees are extended. Okay, let's keep going. So, if you're used to studying muscle anatomy, you might think we're stuck here because we come up to the hamstrings, and where can we go from here? What muscle takes off from here where we can't take a radical change in direction, remember? We got to keep going in the same direction. Well, it isn't a muscle. It's a ligament. The sacrotuberous ligament keeps going right on up from the hamstrings. In fact, you can see it really as a kind of degenerated hamstring because a horse has a hamstring muscle that goes all the way up to the sacrum. But ours has degenerated so we can have this nice strong ligament, but it's still a fascial continuity right up from the hamstrings, right over the sacrotuberous ligament, onto the edge of the sacrum here. Well, once we get up to the sacrum, it's really easy because we're in the lumbosacral fascia here, in the sacral fascia, and we can just travel up on any one of a number of erector spinae muscles here that travel up and over the laminar groove here, this trough, until they reach the occipital ridge. And from the occipital ridge, we don't even stop there. We go right over the top of the skull with the scalp, the gallia aponeurotica, if you want the formal name, and right over here to the brow ridge, and here this train stops. Let me give it a little trim here. So this is where this train stops, is right at the brow ridge, right along here in your brow. The fascia comes over the top of the head and stops here. Of course, there's a fascial continuity down onto the face, but the facial fascia is very soft and malleable, and the hard structural stuff stops at the brow ridge. If you think about a fish, as we looked at earlier, the skull stops above the eye, and that's where our original skull stopped, and that's where this line stops. So now if you look sideways on this skeleton, what you can see is this first myofascial meridian that we have starts all the way from the bottom of the foot, goes around up the back of the leg, continues up the back of the leg to the ischial tuberosity, travels over between the pelvic bone and the sacrum, travels up the back in the laminar groove all the way to the occipital ridge, up over the top of the head, and stops at the brow ridge. This is one plane, and it's a plane that you stretch every time you do a forward bend. Any kind of forward bend. The yoga people use the forward bend, the downward facing dog position, anytime you bend over to pick up your keys. But you can really notice the difference in this. For instance, if you take one of your clients who's stiff and they reach over and they can't really touch their toes without bending their knees, you'd say, oh, well, the hamstrings are short. But if you take a golf ball or a tennis ball and you put it on the floor and you have them rub that tennis ball underneath their feet, or the golf ball underneath their feet, and then you have them lean forward again, what you're going to see is this. Because that plantar fascia, all you've done is stretch the plantar fascia. But you stretch that plantar fascia and you will see that that whole line extends. Another piece in thinking about the line as a whole, if I bend over like this, I'm not stretching that whole line, you see? I'm stretching up to my hips and maybe even along my back, but this part in my neck I've got really contracted. So to lean over and stretch like this is not the same as leaning over and stretching like this, or even like this. So let's look at the superficial back line now as a strip of myofascia that goes over the spinal curves. You can start up here with the cranial curve. The cranial curve is a primary curve. The cervical curve is a secondary curve. The thoracic curve is a primary curve. The lumbar curve is a secondary curve. The sacrococcygeal curve is a primary curve. Now, I know we're stretching a little bit, but the knee curve is a secondary curve, right? And the heel is a primary curve. And the arches are a secondary curve. All the secondary curves that we're looking at here, the cervical when you pick up your head, the lumbar when you start to crawl, the knee when you start to walk, and the arches when you start to walk, are all curves that have to be pulled into being by the balance of the myofasciae. The primary curves are there just as part of the skeleton. The secondary curves have to be held by a balance of the muscles. So now if you look at the knees here, when you're walking, when you're standing, if you jam the knees back into hyperextension, you've got a secondary curve problem. If your arches are fallen, you've got a secondary curve problem. The balance of the knees has the knees off lock, pretty straight, but still in a curve that goes this way. So now it's just an expanded vision of what you've been looking at and been learning, just to see secondary, primary, secondary, primary, secondary, primary, secondary, primary. And the superficial back line is the one that mediates all these primary and secondary curves. So if you see a posture, for instance, here's a common one. If you look at a posture like this, and you compare it to the superficial back line, you can see that the superficial back line is short from my shoulder to my ankle. It's like a bowstring. Here would be a straight posture, well, straight as I can manage in this 50-year-old body, and here would be a short back line posture. One short back line posture. Here would be a posture in which the primary and secondary curves have been reversed. You have a reverse curvature of the knee secondary curve, and that's going to require that you, generally speaking, that you have more of a curvature in the lumbar secondary curve. So these are just a couple of ways in which you can consider the superficial back line as in a clinical way. But the major point that we make here is whatever you see going on in the area of this superficial back line, strain will spread along this line in either direction. I built the line from the feet to the head, but obviously the line pulls from the head to the feet, or from both ends towards the middle, or any way along the line. So you could have an extra short line along the superficial back line in here, or in the hamstrings, and it's going to spread along the line. So knowing the line allows you to say, okay, maybe these hamstrings aren't held right here. Maybe they're held further along the line. Maybe these hamstrings or lower leg aren't short here. Maybe the shortness is really in the plantar fascia. So the power of this is really twofold that I want to sort of get out here as we start these lines in. One is that you can use these lines for global postural assessment to see which line is tighter or which line is looser in a global kind of way. And secondly, these are the lines on which strain travels throughout the myofascia. So if you see really tight hamstrings and you worked on the hamstrings till the cows come home and they're not releasing, maybe it's here, further up the line, that will allow you to release things. Maybe it's all the way up here. I get a lot of juice from working on the scalp. Maybe it's down in the plantar fascia that's going to help you. So that's the second way you can use these lines, is if you're having trouble somewhere along the line, maybe, just like in those tensegrity structures that we were looking at a while back, the problem is coming from someplace more distant along these myofascial meridians. So the superficial back line, starting from the bottom of the foot, goes around the heel, up the back of the leg on the gastrocnemius and hamstrings, the sacrotuberous ligament, and up all the erector spinae muscles and fascia to the back of the head, over the top of the head on the scalp fascia to attach to the brow ridge, and on its way covers all these primary and secondary curves on the back of the body. Hi, we've come out to the beach on a fairly windy day so that we can show you how these lines get stretched. So if we look at the superficial back line, a stretch for the superficial back line here, you can see how a forward bend, especially if the head is let go, is a stretch for the superficial back line. And of course this can occur in many forms. You can do this if you're just seated and leaning forward, it would be the same stretch. So you can see that this is essentially the same stretch to stretch the same superficial back line.